Hello, welcome back to HLM History, where all empires, popular or obscure, have their story told. I really hope you enjoy the video. Thanks for watching. If you've been paying any attention to my channel, you might know that my goal is to have all empires, popular or obscure, to be covered in extensive videos and series. Now, there are a lot of empires, so I definitely won't run out of content anytime soon. In the future, I will allow the audience to vote in polls for the next empire to be covered. However, since this is the first big video on HLM history, I'm deciding to start a multi-part series on ancient Egypt. In this series, I will cover the first pharaohs up to the conquest of Alexander the Great. Now, I will not cover the Ptolemaic kingdom, since I feel like they'll go into their own extensive series that I'll make sometime in the future. Anyways, today's episode will be on the Old Kingdom of Egypt, what came before it, its four great dynasties, and its slow decay and downfall. So, let's get into it. The Egyptian Old Kingdom definitely was not the first era of Egyptian civilization. Before that came the first and second dynasties of the early dynastic period. Even before that, we have the Predynastic period, which is characterized by regional city-states and eventually a united kingdom. Even before that, there were still humans living in Egypt, before the concept of civilization even existed. Let's go back to around 700,000 BC. Around this time, the first humans reached what is now Egypt. Now, they weren't humans as we think of them today. Rather, they are a different species, called Homo erectus. Evidence of the building of structures was found in Nubia, or what is now known as Sudan. These structures have long been destroyed, but evidence of human settlement, including human depressions made in the ground, remain. An interesting thing to note is that multiple times in Egyptian prehistory, the Sahara was not the endless void of desert as we know it as today. Rather, it was more green and more supportive of life, before eventually shifting to sand. We'll talk more about this in a second. Anyways, hunter-gatherer societies and cultures came and went in the area. One region that is interesting, and brought up in Toby Wilkinson's The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, is the region of Nabta. According to Wilkinson, the people of Nabta were pastoralists, and relied on a fresh and steady seasonal supply of water to sustain their livestock. If they arrived at Nabta during a drought, they surely would have perished. What is most interesting about Nabta is that one of the earliest examples of astronomy can be found. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Sahara was a different place before 5000 BC. It was more lush than it is now, and could support places like Nabta with its rain. However, the area began to dry up, and it took shape like it is today, and it seemed that the cultures of Egypt were to disappear with the rain. This wasn't the case, however. Pastoralists that inhabited the now desertified Egypt began migrating to the Nile Valley. Communities and towns sprung up along the Great River. One of the first cultures was the Fayum culture, which sprung along the Fayum Oasis. The Fayum was not too far from the Nile, and would become a popular vacation destination for future pharaohs. The Fayum culture was eventually supplanted by following cultures. It should be understood that change did not happen overnight. The process of the inhabitation of the Nile and the rise and fall of cultures took thousands of years. Another important culture rose around 4500 BC. It was known as the Barbarian culture, which saw a shift towards settlementation. The barbarians themselves were farmers, and slowly, agriculture was developing in Egypt. As time continued, towns and cities slowly developed. Social classes became stratified. The rich became richer and the poor became poorer. Trade was being established, as the upper classes were able to receive luxurious goods. In Upper Egypt, three main power bases were said to have formed: Geni, also known as Tanis, Nubt, and Nekin. In terms of Egyptian unification, there are many different theories. Among them, the story of Narmer is the most popular. Around 3000 BC, there were two power bases in Egypt: Upper and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt consisted of cities in the Delta, while Upper Egypt consisted of cities I mentioned earlier, all in a unified kingdom. A king named Narmer, also known as Menes, depending on who you ask, invaded the northern Delta and conquered it. There is evidence in Egypt and Israel of Narmer, including perhaps the most famous depiction of him, the Narmer palette. I already made a short about Narmer, so if you haven't already, please check it out. The important thing is that Egypt is now united, but there is still no old kingdom. So, where do we go from here? Well, after Narmer unified Egypt, The first Egyptian dynasty was established. Some notable pharaohs include Horah, Narmer's son, who led an expedition to Nubia, and Merenith, possibly Egypt's first female pharaoh. Not too much information is known about the first two dynasties, especially the second dynasty. However, the pharaoh we know the best in terms of the early dynastic period was Khafre. He is the last second dynasty pharaoh. He fought multiple military campaigns, which were most likely civil wars. With the death of Khafre begins perhaps Egypt's second greatest period of all time, the Old Kingdom. But before we get into the Pyramid Age, please make sure you subscribe to the channel. It just takes a second of your time and lets you see more videos about empires throughout history. Thank you. Right away, the Pyramid Age begins with the first pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, Djoser. Djoser's reign saw the city of Memphis become increasingly more and more important. During the Third Dynasty, it would become the capital of the Old Kingdom. Djoser himself is credited for ending a famine, but perhaps his most important achievement was the Step Pyramid of Djoser, Egypt's first Great Pyramid. With the skill of Djoser's vizier, Imhotep, the Pyramid Age began. While not a true pyramid, it is great in its own right. Another important thing about the Step Pyramids is what it reflected of Djoser's times. Only a centralized, stable state with access to a large supply of materials and labor could build a great monument like that. Egypt, as a state, was developing more and more. By Djoser's time, it was well organized and powerful. Imhotep, the vizier who was instrumental for the pyramid's success, is actually worshipped as an actual deity. Huni, the last Third Dynasty pharaoh, was also a great pyramid builder. One of the most recognizable pyramids possibly belonged to Huni. It is known as the Meidum Pyramid, and you can instantly recognize its odd shape. However, now it is suspected that the pyramid's construction actually belonged to Sneferu, who we'll get to very, very soon. All of Huni's other pyramids have eroded and look nothing like the Meidum Pyramid. Other than his pyramids, nothing is really known about him. When he finally kicked the bucket, the Fourth Dynasty, one of the greatest dynasties in Egyptian history, was about to begin. Sneferu was the first king of the height of the Pyramid Age, and boy did this guy make a lot of pyramids. First to address is the Pyramid of Meidum. I already addressed the controversy of whether it belonged to Huni or Sneferu, and it possibly, most likely belonged to him. Sneferu is also responsible for the Red Pyramid, and possibly one of my favorite engineering mistakes, the Bent Pyramid. Obviously, these pyramids were huge and expensive. Sneferu was said to have raided Nubia in search of captives to add manpower to his projects. He also traded with peoples on the Lebanese coast. Egypt at this time, while politically isolated, was not economically isolated. They traded extensively with the Near East. Over time, the two areas would become so interconnected with trade that it would have disastrous consequences. Anyways, even though Sneferu's pyramids had a lot of mistakes, they helped create a format in which future pyramids would be built. His son would definitely take the lessons learned from Sneferu's misadventures. Khufu, the second king of the Fourth Dynasty, perhaps one of the most well-known pharaohs of all time, was up there with Thutmose III, Ramses II, Tutankhamun, and Cleopatra. Helping counter his expensive building project, Khufu began mining in Nubia near Aswan. Egypt at this time was relatively peaceful, and Khufu extended Egypt's borders to the Sinai Peninsula. This was the perfect environment for his great building project. What was this great building project? Khufu's greatest legacy was the Great Pyramid of Giza, which took over 20 years to build, took tens of thousands of laborers, and used massive advancements in engineering to complete. Building this great wonder of the world did not come cheaply. With modern evidence, we know that slave labor was not used towards the pyramid's construction. Instead, conscripted and paid workers were used. Extensive mining throughout the land was also required, so the pyramid could be supplied with its limestone, and advanced organization skills were needed to organize workers and logistics. The pyramid can actually paint a bad picture of Khufu. Huge mega-projects are characteristic of authoritarian regimes, with the people being controlled by the state. This connection, unfortunately, still exists today. Still, Khufu's legacy is massive, and his son, Khafre, wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. However, Djedefre, Khafre's brother and fellow son of Khufu, came to the throne first. He started building his pyramid, but compared to his royal predecessors, his reign was much shorter, and as a result, so was his pyramid. Khafre became the pharaoh of Egypt after his brother's death. Herodotus describes Khafre as a cruel king, just like his father. Khafre's two greatest achievements are next to those of his father's as well. The first is the Great Sphinx, one of the greatest icons of ancient Egypt. His second achievement was his pyramid. Now, if you look closely, it looks like Khafre's pyramid is the tallest of the Great Pyramids. This is actually false. Khufu's pyramid is actually bigger, but Khafre's looks taller because it was built on slightly taller ground. After Khafre was out, Menkaure, his son, came to the throne. Menkaure continued the family tradition and built a third, albeit much smaller, pyramid. You can see, after Khufu, the size of the pyramids started to shrink, especially with Djefre and Menkaure. This could possibly suggest that royal power over the people and access to resources could have diminished. Feel free to look into it more. Shepseskaf followed Menkaure, but his rule was rather brief. As Shepseskaf died, so did the Great Fourth Dynasty, the dynasty that immortalized their name in history through great works and conquest and through tyranny and authoritarianism, was no more. Remember when I said that Egypt was in a golden age under the Fourth Dynasty? Well, the Fifth and especially Sixth Dynasties see Egypt's slow fall to lawlessness, anarchy, and royal decay. The first king of the Fifth Dynasty was Userkaf, who was possibly descended from Djefre. Something to know about the Egyptian dynasties is that sometimes kings from different dynasties could be related. While generally following dynastic rules, some non-dynastic kings can still be grouped into a dynasty, and some related kings can be separated into different dynasties. Userkaf built his pyramid complex close to that of Djoser's. Userkaf, and the Fifth Dynasty itself, show a distinct change in Egyptian religious culture. The Fifth Dynasty saw the age of the Sun Kings. These kings focused more on the sun god, Ra. Userkaf and his successors would also build sun temples to Ra. Speaking of successors, Sahure, son of Userkaf, became the second king of the Fifth Dynasty. His reign saw 20 years of peace. Trade flourished in Egypt, and Sahure is known for the creation of the Egyptian navy. However, perhaps the most well-known Fifth Dynasty pharaoh was also its last, Unas. In terms of his reign, Unas is pretty obscure. However, what he did with his burial chamber is iconic. Unas' tomb was decorated with the so-called pyramid texts. According to World History Encyclopedia, the pyramid texts are the oldest religious writings in the entire world and are some of ancient Egypt's most iconic set of literature. There is speculation that Unas was a particularly weak king, a trait that will become more and more common, especially with the Sixth Dynasty. The pyramid texts could have been used to show the king as strong and mighty. After the death of Unas, the Old Kingdom's fourth and final dynasty began with Teti I. Egyptologists suggest that Egypt was going through a period of instability and unrest. Given that Unas was likely weak, this isn't surprising. Other Fifth Dynasty pharaohs added to this instability, as during their rule, they began weakening the power of the king's authority and the power of the central government itself. More local rulers, like governors, were slowly gaining power, while the pharaohs slowly lost it. Another key indicator of this instability was Teti's own throne name, which meant he who pacifies the two lands. During his rule, Teti attempted to reverse the weakening of his position, but given that the scale of the tombs of officials at the time were great on their own, he may have only had marginalized success. The current narrative is that Teti was assassinated about 12 years into his reign. Userkare, the potential killer of Teti, had an extremely short reign. Pepi I possibly fought Userkare for the throne, given how he tried to deface the cartouches of Userkare. Pepi I reigned for at least 50 years, as attested to by the ancient historian Manetho. The pharaoh's authority continued to weaken more and more. As time went on, local regions began to rule themselves and started paying less mind about the pharaoh. 11 years after Pepi I died, Pepi II assumed the title of pharaoh. The problem with Pepi II was that when he became king, he was literally a child, and when he grew up, he was weak and insignificant. Before I continue talking about Egypt's slow decline, I want to mention something interesting. This guy, supposedly at least, ruled for over 90 years, making him one of the longest ruling monarchs in human history. He got so old that he kept outliving all of his heirs. Of course, over 90 years in the ancient world is an outrageously long time, and Egyptologists suggest he actually reigned for a more modest but still incredibly long 64 years. Either way, during all of that time, Pepi II continued to become more powerless as provincial rulers ruled their own provinces, otherwise known as nomes, as their own kingdoms. The tomb of officials continued to become more grand. Pepi II also divided the important title of vizier into two, having the vizier of Upper Egypt and the vizier of Lower Egypt, further dividing the land. By the time Pepi II finally died, Egypt was essentially shattered. The last two kings of the Sixth Dynasty barely ruled longer than a year. Around 2880 BC, the Sixth Dynasty and the rest of the Old Kingdom was no more. The Old Kingdom was what many see when they think of Egypt, and rightly so. You have the pyramids, the Sphinx, the hieroglyphs, and a great age of peace and prosperity. The Old Kingdom also had backbreaking labor for great mega-projects, famine and disease, which would become more common as the Old Kingdom declined, and it had great authoritarianism that it relied on. And when the power of the authoritarian regime dissipated, so too did the Old Kingdom. The nomes of Egypt were controlled by individual provincial rulers called nomarchs. These nomarchs would continue to fight each other, all in hopes of restoring Egypt under their crown. Famine, war, and disease became daily life. The end of Egypt's first golden age came its first dark age. The glory of the Fourth Dynasty was long gone, and Egypt itself had fallen, for now had begun the First Intermediate Period.